38 men, standing in a line, hands bound. On the morning of December 26, 1862, in Mankato, Minnesota, the largest mass execution in American history unfolded in front of a cheering crowd. And the order came from the same president who had just signed the Emancipation Proclamation, Abraham Lincoln, the man celebrated as the great emancipator. That contradiction alone should stop you cold, because everything you think you know about Native American history, almost all of it, has been filtered through a lens designed to make you look away from moments exactly like that one. Welcome to Frontier Uncensored. I am your host, Dustin, and today we are pulling apart 7 of the biggest lies told about Native Americans. Lies that found their way into school textbooks, Hollywood films, and Thanksgiving dinner conversations. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because we do not sanitize history on this channel. Let us get into it. Picture North America before Columbus, before first European ship crested the horizon. What do you see? If your answer is open wilderness, vast and empty, dotted maybe with a few wandering bands of hunters, you have been fed one of the most successful myths in the history of Western civilization. The truth is staggering by comparison. When Columbus made landfall in 1492, an estimated 20 million indigenous people were living in what is now the United States alone. 20 million. These were not scattered nomads without culture or structure. Across the continent, Native American nations had built civilizations with sophisticated agricultural systems, long-distance trade networks stretching thousands of miles, complex governance structures, oral legal traditions, and cities that in some cases rivaled European population centers of the same era. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, known to many as the Iroquois, operated under a constitution so carefully constructed that multiple historians have argued it directly influenced the framers of the American democratic system. The Mississippian culture had built Cahokia, a city near present-day St. Louis that at its peak housed more people than London did in the year 1250. These were not primitive settlements. These were civilizations. So why do we picture emptiness? Because emptiness justified everything that came next. If the land was empty, you were not displacing anyone. You were settling. If the people were primitive, you were not conquering. You were civilizing. The myth of the empty continent was not an innocent misunderstanding. It was a legal and moral framework constructed to make dispossession look like destiny. And here is the part that should genuinely shake you. By the time historians and settlers began describing North America as wilderness, it already was not. The smallpox that arrived with European contact had already torn through indigenous populations with catastrophic speed, reducing communities by estimates ranging from 50 to 90% before formal colonization had even fully taken hold. Europeans were looking at a landscape that had already been devastated. They called it empty. It was a graveyard. Now here is where it gets even more complicated. And stay with me on this, because the next lie builds directly on the first one. The story goes that Native Americans were too primitive for agriculture, that they did not farm, did not manage land, did not understand property, that they were roaming peoples living hand to mouth, and that European settlers brought civilization, including farming, to a population that had no concept of it. That is not history. That is a story told by people who needed to believe they had earned what they took. The agricultural knowledge of Native American peoples was extraordinary. Centuries before European contact, indigenous farmers across the continent had developed what is known as the Three Sisters system, the intercropping of maize, beans, and squash. These 3 crops were planted together in a way that was almost elegantly scientific. The maize stalks provided structure for the climbing beans. The beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, naturally fertilizing it. The squash spread along the ground, retaining moisture and suppressing weeds. It was sustainable, efficient, and deeply sophisticated. The indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest managed forests with controlled burns to encourage game populations and new plant growth. The Plains nations understood bison migration patterns and managed their relationships with those herds across vast distances. The agricultural tribes of the Southwest built irrigation systems in desert terrain that still command respect from modern engineers. And yet the lie persisted that these peoples could not farm, could not manage land, could not understand property. The truth is more uncomfortable. Native American societies often held land communally, as a shared responsibility, rather than individual ownership. That concept was not a failure of understanding. It was a different philosophy entirely, one that European legal and economic systems were neither willing nor able to accommodate. Calling that difference ignorance was not a mistake. It was a choice. The Pilgrims who landed at Plymouth in 1620 would almost certainly have starved without the agricultural knowledge shared by the Wampanoag people. That is not mythology. That is documented, and the exchange was not entirely one-sided. Indigenous communities did absorb certain European techniques and tools, but the framing that Europeans arrived and taught farming to people who had none is one of the foundational distortions in American origin mythology. Do you think the people who built Cahokia did not understand how to grow food? Let us know what you think in the comments, because I find that assumption genuinely stunning when you hold it up to the evidence. There is a moment in every good historical myth where the villain becomes the victim, and the lie we are about to examine is one of the most brazen examples of that reversal in American history. The narrative went like this. Native Americans could not adapt to civilized society. They were inherently resistant to progress, incapable of functioning within modern institutions, and so their decline was tragic but natural, inevitable, nobody's fault. Here is what that narrative erased. Native American communities faced the deliberate, systematic destruction of their legal standing as human beings and as citizens. They were denied full citizenship rights in a country built on land taken from them. Without citizenship, they had no standing in courts that were already biased against them. Without legal standing, their land claims could be dismissed, their treaties renegotiated or simply ignored, their resources seized through mechanisms that appeared lawful on paper. The concept of being shiftless, a term widely applied to Native Americans, by the same voices claiming they could not adapt, was not a neutral description. It was a slur engineered to justify what was already happening. You declare a population incapable of industry, and you excuse yourself from explaining why their industry was dismantled in the first place. The fur trade reshaped entire nations, pulling communities away from traditional subsistence practices toward a dependency on European trade goods. The bison were systematically reduced, sometimes deliberately, to eliminate the economic and cultural foundation of Plains nations. Boarding schools separated children from language, ceremony, and family across multiple generations. These were not the organic failures of people who could not adapt. These were the targeted results of policies designed to make adaptation impossible while calling the outcome natural. The Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, the incident at Wounded Knee in 1890. These were not the aberrations they are sometimes presented as. They were the violent edge of a policy that had quieter tools working alongside it every single day. Understanding Native American history means refusing to let systemic causes hide behind the language of natural decline. Let us talk about Columbus, because the lie here is one most people think they already know the truth about, and most of them still have it wrong. The rhyme every American child learned goes something like this. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and the image that follows in the classroom is Columbus planting a flag on soil that will become the United States, meeting Native Americans who represent the beginning of American history. Columbus never set foot on the North American mainland, not once. His landfall on October 12, 1492, was on an island in what is now the Bahamas, a place he called San Salvador. His subsequent voyages took him to Cuba, to Hispaniola, to the coast of Central America. He died believing he had reached Asia. He never reached the continent that would become the United States. The indigenous peoples he encountered were the Taino and other Caribbean peoples, not the Native American populations of North America. When we collapse that distinction and teach children that Columbus discovered America and met the Native Americans, we are doing something specific. We're erasing the actual diversity of indigenous peoples across two continents and reducing them to a single, undifferentiated backdrop for a European story. The explorer who reached the North American mainland first, at least among documented European contacts, was John Cabot, sailing in 1497 under English commission. But correcting that particular error does not serve the founding mythology, so it rarely makes the highlight reel. Columbus's matters to the history of the Americas because his voyages opened the door to permanent European contact with the Western Hemisphere. The consequences of that contact were, for the indigenous populations already living here, nearly unimaginable. But mistaking the Caribbean for North America and the Taino for the Lakota is not a small historical error. It reflects something deeper, a tendency to treat all indigenous peoples as interchangeable, as background, as setting, rather than as the complex, distinct, sovereign peoples they were and are. Now here is where the story gets genuinely strange. Because the holiday Americans celebrate every November carries a mythology so detached from historical reality that it has taken on almost its own ecosystem of misconceptions. The Thanksgiving narrative, as most Americans know, it is warm, cooperative, and oddly bloodless. Pilgrims arrive. Wampanoag people help them. Everyone shares a harvest meal. The two cultures find common ground. End of story. Here's what the story actually contains. There was a shared meal in 1621. That part is true. A group of Wampanoag men, likely numbering around 90, arrived after hearing cannon fire and apparently joined what the English were celebrating. It was not a planned intercultural diplomatic event. It was a 3-day gathering that the Wampanoag did not initially understand to be an invitation they had received. The Wampanoag leader, Usamakeen, known to the English as Massasoit, had his own strategic reasons for maintaining a working relationship with the Plymouth colonists. The Wampanoag had been devastated by epidemic disease in the years just before Pilgrim arrival. They were politically vulnerable and saw the English as a potential alliance against rival nations. The meal was not simply generosity, it was geopolitics. And the holiday now called Thanksgiving was not established by the Pilgrims, nor was it linked to that 1621 gathering for centuries. The holiday, as a national observance, was created by Abraham Lincoln in 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, as a gesture of national unity. The warm Pilgrim and Indian story was retrofitted to that holiday. Later, a mythological origin story applied to an occasion that had a very different political purpose at its birth. The conflict that followed the relative peace of the early 1620s is called King Philip's War, named after Usamakeen's son Metacomet, whom the English called King Philip. By 1675, tensions over land, sovereignty, and treaty violations had produced one of the most devastating conflicts in colonial American history. Proportional to the population of New England at the time, it remains one of the deadliest wars ever fought on North American soil. Entire Wampanoag communities were destroyed. The harmony of the Thanksgiving myth and the reality of what followed within a single generation stand in nearly perfect opposition to each other. That gap is not an accident. It is a design feature. So let us come back to that morning in Mankato, Minnesota, December 26, 1862, because now you have enough context to understand what you are actually looking at. The Dakota War of 1862 was not a sudden outbreak of indigenous violence, which is how it was largely characterized at the time. The Dakota Sioux in Minnesota had been facing starvation. The federal government had withheld annuity payments owed under treaty obligations. When a government contractor was asked about the starving Dakota, he reportedly said they could eat grass or their own dung. Tensions that had been building for years exploded into open conflict in August of that year, with violence on multiple sides and casualties among settlers, soldiers, and Dakota people alike. After the conflict ended, more than 300 Dakota men were tried in military proceedings that each lasted on average roughly 5 minutes. No legal counsel, no real opportunity to present a defense. 303 men were sentenced to end their lives. The pressure on Lincoln to carry out all 303 executions was intense. Minnesota officials and much of the white public demanded it. Lincoln did review the cases, a detail often omitted from the myth that paints him as either hero or villain in this episode. He distinguished between those convicted of participating in combat and those convicted of engaging in violence against civilians. He commuted the sentences of 265 men. 38 were executed. That number 38 remains the largest single-day mass execution in United States history, and it happened the day after Christmas. The men who met their fate that morning were hanged simultaneously from a large square scaffold, their bodies cut down and buried in a mass grave along the river. In the weeks and months that followed, at least some of those remains were exhumed by local physicians and used for medical study, a practice that was not uncommon at the time, but that carries its own weight in the context of how Native American remains were treated throughout this period. The rest of the Dakota population in Minnesota, including women, children, and elders, was interned in a concentration camp through the winter of 1862 to 63. Hundreds died of disease and exposure. The survivors were forcibly expelled from Minnesota, the state that had been their homeland for centuries. Was Lincoln making an impossible decision under enormous political pressure? Very likely. Does that context erase the weight of what happened? Absolutely not. The Dakota War and its aftermath sit at the intersection of almost every theme we have talked about today. Broken treaties, starvation used as a tool of policy, legal proceedings designed to deliver a predetermined verdict, and a population whose suffering was framed publicly as a threat that had been neutralized. If that story makes you feel something, drop it in the comments. What do you think of how Lincoln has been remembered versus what actually happened in Minnesota? Before we close, one more myth, and this one has been kept alive by something far more powerful than a textbook. It has been kept alive by a Disney film, watched by hundreds of millions of people. Pocahontas. The film presents a young Powhatan woman falling in love with the English explorer John Smith, a romance between equals, caught between two worlds. It is one of the most enduring images in American popular culture. Almost none of it reflects what the historical record actually contains. Pocahontas, whose given name was Amanut, and who was also known by the more private name Matoaka, was likely born around 1596. When John Smith arrived in Virginia in 1607, she was approximately 10 or 11 years old. The romantic framing of their relationship, even the sanitized Disney version, cannot survive contact with that single fact. The famous story of Pocahontas saving John Smith from execution by laying her head upon his, placing her head over his to stop a ritual ending, is drawn from Smith's own account, written years after the fact and contradicted by his earlier writings, which mention no such event. Many historians believe the scene Smith described, if it happened at all, may have been a ceremonial adoption ritual, not a rescue from actual danger. Pocahontas did not marry John Smith. She married an English colonist named John Rolfe in 1614, after being taken captive by English settlers in 1613. During a period of hostility between the Powhatan Confederacy and Jamestown. During her captivity, she converted to Christianity, took the name Rebecca, and eventually traveled to England with Rolfe, where she was presented at the royal court. She passed away in 1617 at approximately 21 years of age on the ship that was meant to return her to Virginia. Her life was marked by captivity, displacement, and the collision of two worlds, none of which resembled a romance. The real Pocahontas was a young woman who navigated extraordinary circumstances with apparent resilience and intelligence. The mythologized Pocahontas is a projection, a convenient figure through which the violence of early colonization can be reframed as contact, even love. That reframing has consequences, because when the story of colonization is a love story, the machinery of dispossession disappears. And disappearing that machinery is exactly what many of these myths were built to accomplish. Here is what you should carry out of today. The myths we examined were not random errors. They form a coherent picture: an empty land, a primitive people, a natural decline, a harmonious first meeting, a just legal process, a romantic first contact. Each lie supports the others. Together, they construct a version of American history in which nothing was taken because there was nothing to take from people capable of holding it. Dismantling those myths is not an exercise in guilt. It is an exercise in accuracy. You cannot understand what the American frontier actually was without understanding what existed before it, what was dismantled to create it, and what it cost people whose names and nations and stories still exist, even after everything designed to erase them. 38 men, a day after Christmas, and a country that built a mythology spacious enough to look right past it. That is Frontier Uncensored. I am Dustin. If this episode opened something up for you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and subscribe